It was April 1945, the final month of the war in Europe. The Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own chaos. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine, and German resistance was fragmenting village by village. In a makeshift prisoner camp near Remagen, rows of captured Wehrmacht soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder behind barbed wire. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of damp soil and exhaustion. Boots pressed into the muddy ground, leaving imprints that filled with morning dew. A pale light broke over the horizon, spreading across the camp like a slow revelation. The men were silent. Their grey uniforms, once symbols of order and power, were now soaked and torn. Many were farmers, clerks, and teachers, ordinary men pulled into a storm that had consumed their nation. Some clutched tin cups. Others simply stared at the horizon, as if trying to make sense of what remained of their world. Guards shouted commands in English, their breath visible in the chill dawn air. The sound of boots on gravel echoed sharply, cutting through the murmurs. It was here, in this fragile hour between darkness and day, that hundreds of German POWs were ordered to line up. None of them knew what awaited: a transfer, punishment, or mercy. But as the light grew stronger, their faces revealed a single truth shared among them all: defeat had stripped them not only of rank or flag, but of certainty itself. The war was ending, yet for these men, the longest morning of their lives had just begun. It was just after sunrise when the command was given. The air in the camp was still thick with the scent of damp earth and iron, a heavy mixture that clung to every breath. The night had been long and bitterly cold. Many of the men hadn't slept at all. They lay awake on the hard ground, their thoughts circling the same questions. What would happen next, where they were being taken, and whether anyone even knew where they were? Then came that voice, cutting sharply through the early morning fog. "Line up." It was not shouted in rage, but spoken with enough force to leave no room for hesitation. The German prisoners stirred at once, rising slowly from where they had been resting. Some had to help one another up. Others moved stiffly, their limbs still numb from the chill. They began to form lines, uneven and hesitant at first. The ground beneath their boots was soft and uneven, trampled by days of marching and nights of rain. Some tried to straighten their posture, out of habit more than pride, but there was no strength left to maintain discipline. Their faces were drawn, their beards rough and patchy, their eyes dull with fatigue. For months they had lived in a blur of retreat and surrender. Now there was no front line to hold, no officer to obey, only the steady voice of the Allied guards telling them where to stand. The guards themselves moved with calm efficiency. They were young, most of them barely older than the prisoners they were watching. Their uniforms were clean but worn, and their rifles, though held at the ready, were not raised in hostility. They had seen enough of war to know that the men before them were no longer enemies in the same sense they had once been. The battle had been decided long ago. What remained now was procedure, keeping order, maintaining control, ensuring no one tried to escape. Yet, beneath that calm discipline, there was something unspoken in the air, an understanding shared by both sides. This war had broken everyone who had lived through it. The German soldiers lined up, 5 deep, stretching across the muddy clearing. Their boots sank into the earth, making soft squelching sounds with each movement. Steam rose faintly from their bodies in the cool morning air. A few clutched their coats tighter against the cold, while others simply stared straight ahead, unmoving. The sound of the guards' footsteps on the gravel cut through the quiet like metronomic reminders of control. Commands were repeated down the line. Short, firm, and clear. Keep your hands visible. No talking. Yes, forward. One man near the front of the line swallowed hard as he caught sight of the camp's outer fence. A double layer of barbed wire that glistened faintly in the pale light. Beyond it, the countryside spread open and wide, dotted with distant trees and faint smoke rising from some unseen farmhouse. It was the first real morning light he had seen in days, perhaps weeks. And yet, instead of hope, all it stirred in him was a dull ache, because it reminded him of what he had lost. The guards moved closer now, inspecting the lines. They checked uniforms, looked for insignia that might still be attached, making sure no weapons were concealed. Their eyes scanned faces, then moved on. Every motion was practiced, mechanical, like a routine they had done 100 times before. The prisoners followed orders without resistance. There was no reason left to resist. The war had ended for them the moment they had laid down their arms, and now survival depended on obedience. The rumble of engines sounded faintly from beyond the camp. Trucks starting up, the grinding of gears. Somewhere an officer barked a set of orders, and his voice carried over the wire like a note of authority that didn't quite belong in a place of surrender. The men lifted their heads slightly at the sound, instinctively reacting to command as they had done for years. But this time the orders weren't for them. The trucks were being loaded elsewhere. Food, supplies, maybe more prisoners. Whatever it was, it didn't concern them. Their world had shrunk to this small patch of ground, fenced off and watched from all sides. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in those moments. The sky above them was a pale blue, the kind that only appears in early spring, clear but fragile, as if it could break apart with one strong gust of wind. Birds passed overhead, their cries faint but sharp in the stillness. The men shifted occasionally, their breath visible in the cool air, their movements slow and restrained. One of the prisoners near the center of the line, a man named Otto, adjusted the collar of his coat. He had been a teacher before the war, drafted in 1943 when his town ran out of volunteers. He had seen battles on the Western Front, the chaos of retreat, and the surrender that followed. But this silent waiting felt heavier than anything that had come before. Around him, others stood the same way, motionless, resigned. They had once been part of something vast and powerful, but now they were just men waiting for instructions from those they had once fought. The Allied guards began to pace slowly along the rows. One of them, an American sergeant with a scar running across his cheek, moved deliberately, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He stopped occasionally, studying the prisoners with a neutral expression. There was no anger in his face, no triumph, only wariness. He had seen enough to know that victory didn't look like glory. It looked like this tired men in tattered uniforms, standing in mud too broken to speak. For a long while, no one said anything. The camp was eerily quiet, except for the sound of footsteps and the faint rattle of metal as rifles shifted in the guards' hands. The silence was almost heavy, pressing down on everyone equally. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of exhaustion, of men who had spent too long in noise and now didn't know what to do with the absence of it. A gust of wind blew across the clearing, stirring the edges of coats and lifting loose strands of hair. Some of the prisoners flinched instinctively, their bodies reacting as if expecting an order, a shot or an explosion. But nothing came. The wind died down again, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of breathing. The American sergeant finally gave a nod to one of his men. "They're ready," he said quietly. The words carried just far enough to be heard by the nearest line. Ready? For what? No one knew. Some of the prisoners exchanged quick glances, subtle and uncertain. Others stared blankly ahead, refusing to guess. They had learned not to anticipate. In war, expectation was dangerous. It led to disappointment, or worse. The guard stepped back, glancing briefly toward the horizon. The light had grown brighter now, casting longer shadows across the camp. A layer of frost shimmered faintly on the wire fences before melting into droplets. Somewhere beyond the camp, a bell rang faintly, morning roll call for another division, perhaps. Life was continuing elsewhere, even as these men stood frozen in their own suspended moment. One of the prisoners coughed, breaking the silence for just an instant. Another shifted his weight and looked down at his boots. The mud clung to the soles, thick and heavy, making even small movements feel like effort. They waited for another command, but none came. The guards seemed in no hurry. They were trained for patience. The prisoners, however, felt each second stretch like an eternity. For many of them, this ritual, lining up, waiting, being counted, had become the rhythm of their existence. It was strange how quickly human beings could adapt, even to captivity. The fear of death had been replaced by the monotony of survival. The sounds of war shells, engines, gunfire had faded into a distant echo. Now, the only sounds that mattered were footsteps, breathing, and the occasional word spoken by a man holding a rifle. And yet, beneath all the fatigue and resignation, there was something else, a quiet awareness that history was shifting around them. They could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. The war was ending. Germany was collapsing. The Reich that had once promised them victory had left them standing here, unarmed, under another nation's command. When the next order finally came, it was delivered without emotion. Stay in line. Wait for inspection. The voice was firm but calm. The men obeyed without hesitation. Some adjusted their posture out of habit. Others looked toward the guards, trying to read their faces. But there was nothing to read. The morning light fell evenly across all of them, prisoner and guard alike, revealing the same wariness in both. As the sun climbed higher, its rays broke through the last of the mist. The light caught on the barbed wire, making it gleam like silver. Shadows shifted, stretching long across the campyard. Somewhere, a bird called again, its song strangely clear. It was a sound that didn't belong here, and yet it reminded everyone of the world that still existed beyond the fences. In that moment, for just a few breaths, the war felt distant. The men standing in line, muddy, silent, defeated, were not soldiers anymore. They were fathers, sons, brothers, men who had been swept into something far greater than themselves. The command to line up had become more than a military order. It was a symbol of transition, from soldier to prisoner, from war to surrender, from certainty to the unknown. And as they stood beneath the growing light of dawn, surrounded by guards and wire, they all felt the same quiet truth. Something had ended, but nothing had yet begun. The inspection began quietly, without a single raised voice. The sun had climbed a little higher by then, its pale light softening the edges of the barbed wire that surrounded the camp. Dew still clung to the metal, dripping slowly to the mud below. A faint wind stirred, carrying with it the mixed scents of smoke, damp wool, and distant farmland. It was the kind of morning that might have felt peaceful anywhere else. But here, within these fences, it carried only unease. The prisoners stood still in their uneven lines, eyes forward, hands at their sides. They had learned what stillness meant. It was the safest thing they could offer in moments like this. The Allied guards moved slowly through the rows, their boots pressing into the soft earth with measured steps. They were careful, methodical. Not cruel, but not gentle either. Every motion had purpose. They had done this before, many times. Their job was not to humiliate, but to maintain control, to make sure nothing dangerous hid among the prisoners. The men before them were no longer soldiers in uniformed ranks. They were weary captives wearing the remnants of a lost war. Yet, among them could still be an officer concealing an insignia, a man hiding a pistol, or one carrying an order meant never to be found. The process began with a simple gesture, hands visible, coats unbuttoned. The guards checked belts, pockets, sleeves, and boots. Some used their rifle butts to motion prisoners forward, while others spoke quietly, asking the same questions in short, clipped English or through a translator. Anything to declare? Empty your pockets. Step forward. The German men obeyed without resistance. There was no defiance left in them, no argument worth making. The front lines had already taken everything from them. Their weapons, their leaders, their cause. All that remained were fragments of the lives they had carried through the chaos. From time to time, one of the guards would pause, holding up an object for closer inspection. A pocket knife, a small cross, a folded photograph. The items were handed over without protest. For the prisoners, these were not weapons, they were memories. Yet the rules were absolute. No personal items that could be used to escape, no symbols of authority, no sharp edges. A sergeant placed each item carefully into a small wooden box, recording the count with a pencil stub in his logbook. Around him, the world seemed suspended between the echoes of war and the quiet ritual of order. A man near the front of the line drew particular attention. His coat was frayed, the buttons mismatched, but pinned beneath the lapel was a small metal insignia. The eagle and swastika of his regiment. It had lost its shine long ago, dulled by mud and time. One of the guards motioned for him to remove it. The man hesitated only for a second, and then nodded. He unclipped it from his collar and handed it over, eyes lowered. The gesture wasn't dramatic, but it carried a weight far beyond its size. That small badge had once been a mark of pride, a symbol of service and duty. Now it was just another relic of a world that no longer existed. The guard dropped it into the box without comment, and the man returned to his place in the line. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the faint sounds of movement, the creak of belts, the click of buttons, the rustle of paper. Somewhere beyond the camp, a dog barked and was quickly silenced. Inside the wire, no one spoke unless spoken to. The air seemed to hold its breath, heavy with things unspoken. Fear, regret, and the slow realization of what surrender truly meant. One by one, the prisoners surrendered the last pieces of themselves. A cigarette case engraved with initials, a small pocket watch that no longer worked, a folded letter, its corners worn soft from being read too many times. One man produced a ring wrapped in cloth, explaining haltingly that it belonged to his wife. The guard hesitated before taking it, his expression unreadable. He placed it gently into the box with the others. The man nodded once, accepting the loss with quiet dignity. There was no anger, no protest, only the recognition that in war, even memory must sometimes be surrendered. The inspection continued. The guards' faces remained composed, but there was something in their eyes, a flicker of unease, perhaps empathy. They were soldiers too. They knew what it meant to carry tokens of home into places of death. Many of them had letters folded into their own pockets, photographs tucked into helmets, medals left at the bottom of duffel bags. But here, roles mattered more than sentiment. The prisoners were not men to them in that moment. They were responsibility, paperwork, procedure. The German prisoners, for their part, tried to maintain composure. They stood straight, their expressions blank, even as the guards examined their belongings. But beneath that stillness was exhaustion, a kind of weariness that had gone beyond physical. It was the fatigue of men who had watched their world collapse piece by piece, who had walked through ruined towns and buried comrades in frozen ground. The inspection felt less like punishment and more like ritual, as if each item handed over was another acknowledgement of defeat. When the guards moved down the line, a man in his 40s reached slowly into his breast pocket. His fingers trembled as he pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in careful handwriting. The guard motioned for him to hand it over. The man hesitated, then spoke softly in German, a few words that needed no translation, bitte lesen, nicht nehmen. Please just read, don't take it. The guard didn't understand the words, but understood the tone. He looked at the letter for a long moment, then nodded once and handed it back. Not every rule needed to be enforced when humanity could still be recognized. As the morning wore on, the light grew warmer, casting long shadows across the camp. The frost melted from the fences, dripping slowly into the mud below. Some of the men blinked against the brightness, their eyes still adjusting after days of overcast skies and sleepless nights. For the first time in weeks, they could feel the faint warmth of the sun on their faces. It wasn't enough to comfort them, but it was enough to remind them they were still alive. The inspection reached its midpoint, and the guards paused for a brief rest. They leaned against posts, lit cigarettes, and murmured among themselves. The prisoners remained in line unmoving, unsure if they were allowed to relax. The thin smoke from the guards' cigarettes drifted across the air, mixing with the smell of wet soil and sweat. Somewhere at the far end of the camp, a kettle clanged, the sound of someone preparing coffee, or maybe soup. It was faint, almost ghostly, but it reminded the men that time was still passing. One of the Allied officers, a tall man with a calm expression, began moving through the rows again. He didn't speak much, only glanced at faces, made small notes in his book, and occasionally signaled for a man to step out of line. Those chosen were led aside, their belongings checked more carefully. Most were returned without issue. A few were separated for questioning. Officers, medics, or men wearing distinctive patches. The process was slow, deliberate, and strangely impersonal. It was war reduced to paperwork and observation, to ensuring order where chaos had once reigned. The silence continued to deepen as the inspection drew toward its end. By now, the men were shivering less from cold than from fatigue. Their bodies had grown used to standing, their minds drifting into a numb, dreamlike state. Each movement, each instruction, felt distant, like something happening to someone else. They watched as small piles of confiscated items grew: buttons, knives, pins, bits of paper. Tiny fragments of identity stripped away and catalogued. Then, somewhere down the line, a small sound broke the rhythm, the faint clink of metal hitting the ground. A guard turned quickly. One of the prisoners had dropped a chain from his pocket, a small crucifix attached to it. He bent to pick it up, but a guard's hand stopped him mid-motion. There was no aggression, only caution. The guard picked up the chain himself, turning it over in his fingers. The prisoner stood motionless, his jaw tight, eyes downcast. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the guard placed the crucifix back into the man's palm and nodded. The prisoner blinked, nodded in return, and slipped it quietly back into his pocket. Not all moments in war are marked by violence. Some are defined by silence, by the simple act of allowing another man to keep something that reminds him he's still human. By late morning, the inspection was nearly done. The guards gathered the boxes of confiscated items, sealed them, and carried them toward the command tent. The prisoners remained in formation, waiting for the signal that it was over. The air had warmed slightly, though the ground was still wet. The men's boots were caked with mud. A few shifted their weight, adjusting their balance, but none dared to move freely. The wind blew again, this time carrying the faint scent of grass beyond the fence. It was the smell of open fields of freedom, just out of reach. Somewhere behind them, an Allied truck backfired, startling a few of the younger guards. The sound echoed off the wire, momentarily snapping everyone's focus back to the present. Then, as quickly as it came, the noise faded, leaving behind the same stillness as before. Finally, an order was given. Inspection complete. The voice carried across the camp, clear and final. The men exhaled, some audibly. Shoulders slumped and heads bowed slightly. It wasn't relief. Not exactly. It was more the release of tension that had held their bodies rigid for hours. They were told to stand by for further instructions. The guards stepped back, some turning to speak quietly among themselves. The prisoners waited, the silence returning like a familiar companion. For many of them, the inspection was more than a security measure. It was a moment of reckoning, a quiet inventory of what they had become. Each pocket emptied, each item taken or returned, reminded them of who they had been before the war and how far they had fallen from it. It was not humiliation they felt, but a slow, sinking understanding of loss. The kind that could not be measured in territory or rank, but in the smallest, most personal things. The letter, the ring, the photograph. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint sound of birds beyond the camp's perimeter. A few of the men looked up, following the sound instinctively. It was a small thing, but for the first time in a long time, they noticed the sky, wide, endless, and untouched by war. The order came quietly, without warning. The prisoners had been standing for hours by then, their legs numb and their bodies heavy from fatigue. The morning sun had risen high, burning away the mist that had blanketed the camp since dawn. Its warmth now pressed against their backs, mingling with the smell of damp wool, rusted metal and earth. They expected another command, perhaps to move, to march, or to load into trucks. But instead, an unexpected word rippled down the line: food. For a moment, no one reacted. It was as if the sound had reached them through water. Distant, muffled. Unbelievable. Food many of these men hadn't eaten properly in days. Their rations had run out long before their surrender, and what little they had managed to scavenge on the march to the camp had been shared in crumbs and drops. The human body learns to endure hunger, but the mind never quite adjusts. So when they heard that word, the first instinct was disbelief. It felt like a trick of language, something lost in translation between captor and captive. Then they saw movement at the far end of the yard. Allied soldiers were carrying large metal containers, heavy field pots that steamed faintly in the sunlight. The smell came before the sight, something warm, earthy and faintly spiced. The wind carried it across the camp, and the men straightened slightly without meaning to. The sound of metal clanging against metal echoed through the still air as ladles struck the sides of pots. The sight of it, the steam rising, the guards setting down buckets of bread, the faint shimmer of soup in the light, felt almost unreal. One of the guards shouted, "Step forward." "5 at a time!" His voice was steady, neither harsh nor kind. It was simply procedural, but to the prisoners, it sounded like a summons from another world. The first few in line hesitated, unsure whether it was safe to move. An American sergeant raised his hand, gesturing them forward. They obeyed cautiously, their boots dragging slightly through the mud. At the front, soldiers stood beside tables made of rough planks laid over barrels. On them sat large tins of stew, baskets of bread, and metal cups filled with water. The food wasn't much, just what the camp's kitchens could spare. But to those who had gone without for so long, it looked like abundance. The first man in line held out his tin bowl with shaking hands. The guard ladled in a portion of stew thick with beans and vegetables and handed him a piece of bread. The man stared at it for a moment before nodding, his lips trembling slightly. He stepped aside, still holding the bowl as though it might disappear if he blinked. When he finally brought the spoon to his mouth, his hands trembled so violently that a few drops spilled onto the ground. He didn't notice. The warmth spread through him like fire after endless cold. Others followed, each one moving with the same mixture of disbelief and restraint. They ate slowly, as if not trusting that it was truly meant for them. There was no conversation, no laughter, no visible relief. The camp remained quiet, the only sounds the clink of spoons and the low murmur of guards directing the next group forward. The act itself, feeding the defeated, was simple, but its meaning ran deep. These were men who, only weeks earlier, had been enemies. They had fought against the same soldiers who now handed them food. Many of them had marched under banners that promised domination, had believed in words that divided humanity. And now, those same hands they once fought against were offering sustenance. Not out of pity, not even out of friendship, but out of duty, perhaps even a sense of decency that war had not managed to erase. For the guards, too, it was a strange experience. Some avoided eye contact, their movements mechanical, as though the action of feeding prisoners made them uncomfortable. Others watched quietly, their expressions unreadable. A few even offered small gestures, a nod, a brief word, a faint smile, the kind of silent acknowledgement that needed no language. One young American corporal, standing at the far end of the table, noticed an older German soldier hesitating before taking his portion. The man's uniform hung loosely from his frame, his face gaunt and pale. The corporal met his eyes and said softly, "Go ahead." The German nodded slightly and reached out. When their hands brushed, both froze for a heartbeat. It was a strange, fleeting moment. A recognition that both were young once, both had families, both had been shaped by orders beyond their choosing. The corporal looked away quickly, scooping another ladle of stew for the next man. Nearby, a German soldier sat on the ground, holding his bowl in both hands. He didn't eat immediately. Instead, he stared into it as steam rose toward his face. The smell reminded him of home, of his mother's kitchen, of the years before the war, before the hunger and marching and fear. He could almost hear her voice again, calling him in from the fields for supper. When he finally took his first bite, his eyes filled, though he said nothing. Around him, others ate in silence, some weeping quietly. others too drained to feel anything at all. For a moment, the camp seemed suspended in time, the chaos of war held at bay by something profoundly ordinary. Men eating, men sharing food, men rediscovering, in the simplest act, the possibility of humanity. The guards continued to distribute meals, their movements rhythmic and patient. Every few minutes, another pot would be replaced, another line of men served. At the edges of the camp, a few guards stood watch, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They weren't expecting trouble. The German prisoners, even the younger ones, were too weak, too defeated to think of rebellion. They ate quietly, heads bowed, some leaning against the fence for balance. The sun climbed higher, drying the mud beneath their boots. A few men exchanged short sentences in hushed voices. One muttered about his hometown. Another whispered that he hadn't eaten bread in 3 days. A third simply said, "They are feeding us." The words hung in the air like disbelief turned to gratitude. For some, the act of receiving food carried shame. They had been raised to believe in strength, in superiority, in the myth that mercy was weakness. Yet here they were, their survival dependent on the compassion of those they had once been told were enemies. The contradiction stung more than the hunger ever had. But beneath that sting, there was something else, an awakening. The realization that even in defeat, one could still be treated as human. An older prisoner, a former officer by his posture and bearing, sat quietly apart from the others. His uniform still bore faint traces of rank, though the insignia had been stripped away. He took his bread and tore it into small pieces, eating slowly, thoughtfully. His eyes wandered across the camp, the barbed wire, the guards, the rows of exhausted men. For years he had believed that strength was measured in control, in discipline, in the ability to command. But now, watching his men eat in silence, he began to understand a different truth. That dignity was not taken away by surrender. It was taken by cruelty and restored somehow by compassion. At the far end of the yard, a small group of guards leaned against the fence, watching the scene unfold. One of them, a British soldier, lit a cigarette and said quietly, "Never thought I'd see the day I'd be feeding Germans." Another shrugged. "War's over for them," he said. "No point starving men who've already lost." The first guard nodded, exhaling smoke into the air. "Funny thing," he murmured. "After all that killing, it comes down to this: soup and silence." The men continued to eat until every pot was empty. Some licked their bowls clean. Others saved half their bread, tucking it carefully into their coats for later. When the last of the food was gone, the guards collected the empty containers, scraping out what remained into one last tin for the latecomers. The camp grew quiet again. The men sat in clusters or alone, their bodies finally still. The sun had warmed the air enough to make it bearable, and for the first time since being captured, some allowed themselves to relax. A few of the guards began cleaning up, stacking bowls, wiping the makeshift tables. The prisoners watched, too weary to move, but something had shifted among them. The tension that had hung like wire between both sides seemed to ease, if only slightly. The act of sharing food had done what no order or threat could. It reminded everyone that war, for all its cruelty, could not erase the simplest truths of being human. Hours later, when the camp settled into its afternoon stillness, the memory of that meal lingered. Some of the prisoners lay back against the ground, staring up at the open sky. Others whispered prayers or names, or words of thanks that went unheard. And though the fences still stood, and the guards still watched, something inside the men had changed. They had expected punishment, perhaps even humiliation. What they received instead was something far more powerful. A reminder that even in defeat, compassion could exist. It was not forgiveness. The war had cost too much for that. But it was mercy, quiet and unspoken, offered in a bowl of warm stew under a grey morning sky. By the time the sun began to set, long shadows stretched across the camp once more. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faint sounds of trucks departing in the distance. The prisoners gathered what little they had left and waited for the next command. But the memory of that meal, the warmth, the brief stillness, the humanity of it, remained. In the silence that followed, one truth became clear in war. Cruelty often comes expected, but mercy always arrives like a miracle.